Hi everyone, welcome. The systems that you see right here are the ones that I am due to check in on today. They're the African night crawlers that I received from Northeast Worms. It's the reason I've still got the Northeast Worms sticker on here. The original worm bunch that I got from Northeast Worms lived in another container for a while, and they've since finished that batch of composting and are now 108 days into their second batch of material that they're working down. And at that time, when I relocated the worms and positioned them into a nice new home with fresh bedding and fresh food, I held on to their castings and held them in this slightly more shallow container resting on top. And the stuff was pretty damp, you know. It seemed to me like the material was just way too damp, and that's the reason it's sitting here uncovered. And at some point we figured we might try to, get the worms that we assumed were left behind during the worm migration. We thought we'd try to get them out of there. And, well, at that time we also assumed that the worms were probably leaving behind a bunch of cocoons that had, some time needed before they would hatch and produce baby worms. So hopefully by now, after 108 days, what we're looking at here is the completion of a cocoon nursery that we could start trying to round up the worms from. So I was thinking that if possible, we're going to get the migration or the baiting of the worms in the nursery underway. And while we're in here, the system here is also due for a feeding. So far, over those 108 days, it's been fed 7 times. This would be its 8th feeding. And I would imagine that after 17 days, it's ready for one. So I'm going to get these 2 systems up onto the bench, and we're going to get to work. So what we've got here is the nursery, cocoon nursery. And I think the reason we haven't tried getting worms out of here yet was because we assumed that the material was just way too damp and cozy, that the worms would never want to leave it. It's the reason we've been working so hard to try to let this stuff dry. And it's not too deep either. I mean, if you drill your finger down, what are we talking about? Hardly anything. There's not a lot of material in here. But I could feel as I probed into the material how nice and damp it is. It's just incredible the way castings, even left to, the air, manage to hang on to their moisture so incredibly. So I'm hoping that the worms that are in here are feeling the same way, that the moisture is ample and comfortable. I mean, it seemed that way to me, but, my needs and the worms' needs could be way different. So what I've been doing lately is just trying to collect up all these things that are always out on the top surface, the driest stuff that's certainly seen no worm action. So I would like to see how things look down in the bin, but getting all that stuff in the way sort of skews my, impression of what I'm seeing. So I figured if I could just get it out of my way at first, just slip it into some other container briefly, then I know it's all in one place, and at the end we can even use it to, do something where there's some moisture involved to try to get it rehydrated or whatever, or maybe just at least submerge it and mix it with the more damp stuff that's in the system in general. Now, I guess when we start tilling around in here, we're going to get a sense of whether or not we have anything in terms of babies. So we're just going to start probing through the material. I mean, I know that when we migrated the worms originally, there's always that chance that some of what stayed behind were just stragglers that didn't get rounded up and relocated. But I would hope that the majority of what we see in here are worms that were actually born in here from the cocoons that were left behind by their parents after the parents got hauled out and relocated. So the stuff is really nice. I like how it all crumbles right in my hands. Nice and cool and damp, luckily, still too. So stuff that the worms are probably okay in. I'd like to think they are, at least. And, most of the worms are little guys, but I mean this one right here, even though he's small, I see the clitellum developed on his body, meaning that he's at, reproductive age. And after 100 and some odd days, I would think even worms that were born here are probably now old enough to have babies of their own. And I guess that's the whole timing thing of one of these, is that you want to, rear the cocoons, rear the babies from their cocoons, and get them like kind of big enough and mobile enough and kind of moving around and doing their own things, rather than just sort of being a little tiny nothing in the middle of a big sea of castings. You've got to give them a little bit of time to sort of become big enough to be rounded up and collected. Or at least that's what I think. You know, I'm not sure if people have success rounding up like really, really tiny, newly born worms, or do they also, most people actually wait for their worms in their nurseries to develop to a slightly older age, slightly larger size before trying to round them up? That's just what I do. I don't know if others do the same, but it seems like the way to do it. It seems we have the option to migrate the worms, and usually when I migrate the worms, I just set up one end of the bin as sort of the horizontal migration feeding zone, and then in this kind of horizontal direction across the bin, they make their way eventually into the feeding area, realize that there's all kinds of nice fresh bedding and food and moisture there for them, and they stay, eventually evacuating the material on their own over time. And if there's not a lot of food, not a lot of moisture, these worms are going to go looking for something better. I guess the other option is to use like a little bait box, sort of like what I did recently in another of my systems, but this seems a little bit larger than what I had in the other system. I'm starting to wonder if maybe horizontal migration would be the best way to try to round up all the worms in here. And you know, when this thing started 107 days ago, it was treated as evacuated material. So all the worms that you're seeing in here were definitely not here then. I'm willing to accept the fact that, you know, my method of rounding up and relocating the worms is imperfect and will leave behind stragglers. I'm always willing to accept and admit that that's just part of my process. But you already saw how many worms are present in this material. They're all over the place. There's a good amount of them. Definitely hundreds and hundreds of worms as far as I could tell based on just looking at it. And I would have to guess that they were all born here, you know, or at least a good portion of them. So the stuff is nice. I've broken up a good bit of it. I could probably just go on and on breaking this stuff up, but I really think it's down to the point where we, and aerating it like this is going to help a lot too with the further drying of it and helping with the motivation for the worms to move out. But I think we're just going to set up one edge of the bin over here with some fresh bedding, some fresh food, some nice dampness, maybe plastic covering to keep it that way, not let it dry out. Because, you know, you set up a fresh baiting area, you don't cover it up. It's not like the castings. The castings have that incredible ability to hang on to their moisture, but your feeding zone isn't like that at all. So if you want to keep it damp, you got to keep it protected from evaporation. So we're going to equip this edge of the bin with a migration feeding zone, and then we can get on to feeding the bin that's got the adult worms in it. So let me get some stuff together. We'll take a short break, and we'll regroup when we're ready to set this thing up. Yes, it's one of my famous dividers, and it's not so much meant to divide either, right? It's really just there for me, visual aid, partition, so I could see where the castings end and the baiting area or the migration feeding zone begins. And I guess something about that size should work. I've got a couple tubes of cardboard here too that seem about the same size, so those can be kind of our little spacers. Yeah, that looks like a good size. And if we backfill the rest of the space in here, I think we'll be back to maybe a little bit deeper than we saw earlier, definitely deeper than what we saw earlier. By fluffing it up, I think I've added a lot of volume to it just by air. And that depth that we saw before is now nearly double that, I would say. You know, based partially on the reduced amount of space for it to be in, but also with the fluffing and aeration. And we're going to leave this stuff uncovered, just the way you saw it when I pulled it up onto the bench. We're going to let it keep drying. And over here on the feeding area, I think we're going to recycle some of this nice stuff that's really part of this bin. It's just leftover chunks of this and that. But since we're going to be doing a good job, you know, adding a whole bunch of moisture to this feeding area too, this stuff will get re-moistened and reactivated, kind of put back into service. It'll also introduce a little bit of, you know, microbiology into this feeding area. So we'll grab a little bit of my homemade, pre-made, prepped, shredded paper, cardboard, and leaf combination bedding. It's pretty damp, this batch. It's got a good moisture content to it, so that's kind of good. I think underneath the food we can even put in a little bit of this in, but then we can even sprinkle it on top. Try to spread this stuff around. Now, the foods that I bought down here, frozen cucumber, frozen carrot. And, you know, what I've got here is not meant just for this. It's meant for feeding the adult system too. So we're going to throw in a portion of this. Put in a pretty good portion. Want it to be a nice, attractive place to get the worms to come over to. Oh, I thought it was cucumber peels, but it's actually pea pods. Actually, it's both. Okay. And got a little bit of coffee in here too. What the heck? Let's increase the appeal for all those wormies in here that like their coffee. And besides that, we've also got some of my worm chow that we can include. But before we do that, we're going to throw in a little bit more of this bedding here. Kind of build out this feeding area. I think I like what I see here. It's looking pretty good size. And I want to make sure we butt it up to the cardboard. And, ooh, that's a lot of grit, but it doesn't matter. I got plenty of this stuff to go around. Let's not forget my worm chow. This stuff's pretty popular too. It's a new recipe I haven't really had a chance to try in many places yet, so these are one of the first batches of worms that get to try it, so hopefully they like it. This batch includes some cornstarch and it includes some birdseed, a couple interesting things that I've never used before in my worm chows. So what else do we need here? We got food, we got bedding. You know what I think? A little bit more worm chow, a little bit more bedding, and I want to get my squirt bottle and add a lot of moisture to this setup over here. That's what I want to do. Alright, they're going to like this. I've not used my spray bottle in a couple weeks. Hopefully there's some pressure in here still. Yep, it's holding up good. I had pumped it up, hardly used it. I knew there was a good amount of pressure in here when I put it away. It's kind of nice to be able to just grab this thing and you're ready to go. I don't really use it that often though. I'm not into adding moisture to my systems usually. I usually like the idea of adding the moisture via the food that I give them. And then, you know, adjusting with drier foods or completely dry foods at times when I feel like there's plenty of moisture in the system, or going the other way, giving them really damp, juicy stuff when it seems like adding moisture to the system would make good sense. And I think what we've done here was created a really nice moisture haven for these little guys. I think they're going to appreciate this. Any worms that stumble on this, come on over for a nice little extra moisture, extra fresh bedding, or some of the food in there. I think that they'll probably stay. And I think the only thing remaining is protecting this area from drying out just by covering it up. So we're going to throw a plastic bag over it. Nothing fancy, but I got a feeling it's going to work pretty well, because I don't know if it comes through on the camera, but this stuff is, you know, getting pretty dry, getting pretty barren of any remaining food scraps in it. 108 days just sitting here as castings only, and for weeks now just sitting here drying. I got a feeling these worms are really going to like that once they stumble on it. So let's get the regular adult bin out here and get them fed. Alrighty, here we go. Now this bin's not to be confused with another of my systems where I'm using a similar bag to this. The other system that's got the bag like this, those are the red wigglers that came out of my compost barrel. But as we know, these are the African night crawlers that came from Gaetano over at Northeast Worms. This coffee filter here is showing us where we last fed, right down the middle. And you know what? Let's recycle this piece of paper here as bedding as part of the feeding, because I've got another one, a fresh one over there with the coffee still in it. So once we fed them the coffee, we'll use that brand new coffee filter to indicate to ourselves where we last fed. No reason to change what we've been doing. We've been feeding down the middle here. We'll stick to that pattern. And I like this thing of scraping off the top too, because it seems like you're not just blending a whole bunch of stuff in and then sort of tainting the appearance of your material. This way you get a better sense of what's really going on under the covers. And then and even when it comes time to add the feeding, sometimes this stuff right here I think is probably the best bedding in the world. Stuff that's already been in the bin. It's quite seasoned, even though it's a little bit dry from sitting out on the surface. A little bit of moisture and the stuff is pretty much hitting the ground running. So we'll definitely use this when we set up the feeding area. Oh yeah, there's plenty to be had down here if you wanted to collect up some more, but I think what we've done was taken enough of it out of the picture so we can now kind of objectively look at what is our current state for a 108-day-old bin with an estimated, what did the board say over there? I think I wrote it down, didn't I? An estimated 2,030 African night crawlers is what we estimated, I guess. Usually when we move my worms, when we're rounding them up, when we're releasing them, we have opportunities to see them. And obviously not count them individually, but still see them and in general, you know, get a sense of how many we're looking at there. So I always really enjoy getting people's feedback on how many worms they think they saw when I did a worm release. We won't be doing that today. No worms to be released here. We're just feeding. And the material out here is really nice. Not too damp, fortunately. Even though we're covering up here, it's not getting overly damp. It's just the time of year when my... Oops, oh boy. It's just the time of year when I no longer have that extreme drying effect of my furnace running and the heat getting blown around all around the house, drying out the air in the house. And also, as a result, drying out the worm bins, sucking the moisture out of them. Here, we got a really nice moisture level. It's got a good dampness to it. It's all nice and flaky, so none of it's getting overly damp and muddy, which is what I, get concerned about sometimes. So if I start seeing that, then it, I don't know why, but I guess I've had bad experiences with, material that's kind of like clumpy and nasty, and I just don't want to see it happening. I always get so jealous when I watch some of these other channels where the material is so flaky and flowing. It's kind of been my goal to try to get my systems looking like that too. And this system's feeling really nice. The material's all flaky and flowy. Let's see, the feeding they got last time was like what I always sort of classify as a boring kind of a feeding, because it was coffee, maybe some worm chow, but it was not like any sort of a colorful, not like today with the orange and the green and all the nice vibrant colors of the food they're getting today. Not that worms give a damn about the color of their food, it's just, the presentation value for the videos. Instead of just brown against brown piled on with a little bit more brown, at least we get a little splash of color, right? Brighten up our day while we're worm farming. So, let's see. Yeah, there was also material placed in here alongside the food that I got some interesting comments on. The comments, well, actually one person's comment that actually even led me to the setup of an experiment was somebody who told me how, in their experience, when they used the type of bedding that I used last time, which was a bunch of paper towels, bunch of napkins, kind of this lighter, softer, fluffier sort of bedding material, papers, that stuff, in their experience, heats up tremendously, especially in the summertime, and that they don't even use it in the summertime. So I think this might be a piece of paper towel here. So they had observed how I had set up the bedding in this, I believe it was this system last time, and commented. And then I even went so far as to set up a test, trying to pit my typical everyday bedding against some bedding that's set up with predominantly that type of material. So we'll see how that test goes, but we're not here to talk about that bin. We're here to talk about this bin. Get these little guys fed. So, yeah, I was just trying to get a rough sense of whether or not our estimate of 2,000 plus worms in here was realistic. I think it is. Definitely think it is. Because I believe in here, too, what we're seeing is just tons and tons of babies. Not only in the cocoon nursery, but here, too, where all the adults were moved over into, you can imagine, ongoing breeding and mating. So I think what we got in here is probably in excess of what our original starting estimated number was, but after 100 days, not too surprising. It's pretty much par for the course, I believe. Give worms time to reproduce, they'll reproduce. I guess the only other variables is just giving them the space to do it in, and the food and everything else. I guess that sense of well-being is what you're giving them, so that they do believe that, spawning off a new population and increasing the numbers is the right decision to make, because they do seem to decide either to do it or not based on certain conditions you can tune. Alright, I'm coming in with my pre-made bedding over here. We're going to be generous here as well. These are African night crawlers. These worms definitely like their carbon-based foods. So other worms might see this as bedding to just hang out in. The worms here, these African night crawlers, they see this stuff pretty much as like the same as the food we're giving them, perhaps even more so as the food that they like. So the carrots and the beans and the pieces of cucumber peel and the coffee that we're giving them as the actual food, kind of a nice thing. But I got a feeling that these particular worms really like what we just placed in here, this stuff right here. So let's see, we had some old mango seeds here, very old. And what else do we have here? Just a couple little pieces of scraps of bedding. So let's get all that stuff right back down in there, and let's not forget about all this recycled dry stuff we pulled off the top. I got a feeling putting it down here is going to be exactly what it needed. It's going to get it all nice and damp again. I'm reluctant to add moisture. I don't know. Do we, don't we? Those frozen veggies will emit a little bit of moisture as they thaw. The coffee doesn't have a whole lot of moisture to it. I mean, I pulled it out of the coffee maker last night. It's been sitting out, drying. So the coffee, a little bit of moisture content, but hardly enough to talk about. So I think maybe we could even spray a little bit of water in here. Should we? I don't know. That is a good amount of veggie material. I didn't quite think it was that much. In fact, I thought we were being a little bit chintzy and giving them less than a fair portion. But it does seem like I had a whole lot more in this bag than I expected. So you know what? I don't feel so bad anymore. I think these little guys are going to do a great job working this stuff down. They love carrots. That stuff's going to go pretty quick. I believe that these sugar snap peas or whatever these are, those are going to go pretty quick too. Cucumber skins. This is another one of those types of feedings that I believe is not going to last. It's going to go quick, If we were to wait another 17 days between the next check-in and now, I got a feeling we would see very little, if any, leftovers of this stuff. So, looks like a pretty good feeding, but we can even make it better by adding some worm chow. Man, what a feeding. They're going to love this. This is going to just be like a huge crevice over here when we come back in here next time. And I got a feeling we'll probably have to come back in here sooner than 17 days. I guess over the winter I got used to the fact that some of my systems were slowed and that the worm activity was a little bit slower than I was accustomed to seeing normally, so I was kind of elongating the time between check-ins. But I believe now that things are warming up, it's realistic to expect that the worms are going to work their way through portions a lot more quickly than they had in the past. Not to mention, I believe just the worm count in here definitely seems like a lot more than 2,000, so definitely a lot more than we started out with. So its productivity, its capability, definitely well beyond what it started out with all those months and weeks ago. So right where we fed is down the middle over here, but you know what? I almost forgot to sprinkle the last of this stuff in here. So it's not getting submerged as well as I had hoped it would, but it's right there above the food. So I got a feeling it's going to, I think it's going to get chomped on pretty good. Yeah, definitely. Right there over the food, not to mention also protected from drying a little bit better than the rest of the bin by being right here underneath the feeding zone indicator. So this is going to be a fun bin to check in on. I don't know why, I just had this feeling like this system was kind of ho-hum and not really very exciting and wasn't really doing much, but now I feel a little bit different because there's lots and lots of worms in here. And when it comes time to round up the worms out of that cocoon nursery, putting them in here with these guys, it's going to create almost an overcrowding. It almost makes me feel like some sort of synchronization of the worms collected from that system could maybe combined with something, maybe trying to round up some worms from here and maybe spawning them off into a new system somewhere else and then letting who remains continue. I don't know, I got to kick that around. If people got some suggestions on what to do there, I'd like to hear it. So that's it for the video today, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I got a little bit of stuff to clean up and put away, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. That's boring. Before I go, though, let me really quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.